Wesley Ueunten, and a lot of you here are in my class, the Japanese American Art and Literature class, and others are from Professor Abudlhadi's class.
Colonialism, imperialism, and resistance, territory movements then and now.
Then and now part is very important. And I guess I'll start it off, and I'd like to thank or speak on behalf of the Asian American Studies Department, and also thank AMED for co-hosting this event. Thank you for guests here, or other faculty, and especially like to thank the students, all of you students and other people who came. It's kind of want to apologize for the heat in here, and it's almost like we had a conspiracy against this event. It's like it happened to rain on this event. The room got something happened with the room, so we had to shift into this room. We had people who got sick. It's almost like a conspiracy, but it's a miracle that we're all here. So I'd like to thank all of you for actually being here. That's the most important thing. And the other conspiracy is I was so busy running around that I didn't really write down what I was going to say for these opening remarks. I'm just speaking right now. But I assure you, I speak from the heart. And if anything, if I have a philosophy for my personal life, my scholarship, and even my pedagogy, it's and I think my students have heard it enough that they're maybe tired of hearing it, but I'll say it again, is the core of my philosophy is to ask questions, or to generate questions, and to value questions. Because I think that questions are where we begin our quest for new knowledge and self-development. So I think many of you, talking about generating questions, are probably going, what are we here for? What are we here at an event? Well, the event, today's title is Day of Remembrance 2016, criminalizing Arab, Asians, and Muslims then and now. So what are we doing at an event like that? What are we here for? My response to that is another question that I want you to think about is, why do we even have these categories of differences where we categorize each other as someone different, and we feel like, wow, it's so strange that we're here with other people. So, and then from that we jump off to another question of, why do certain groups become criminalized? And then some groups are criminalized over time, constantly. Some groups are criminalized and not criminalized and criminalized again. So maybe that's a question that we can all ponder, but what's the context for certain groups being criminalized? And then from a personal perspective is, we're all here, and how do we, we've talked a lot about solidarity. How do we get people to actually cross these borders of those, what often in class we talk about social constructions that keep us apart. How do we break those or cross those social constructions and reach out to other people to create solidarity, real solidarity, not just talking about it, just make friends, talk to each other, eat together, just get to know each other. So I have all these questions. How do we actually move towards solidarity? And the other question, just to spend 30 seconds on this, to actually begin maybe walking towards solidarity is, a lot of you are not in the same class, or even in the same class, you don't know the person next to you. Maybe for 30 seconds, ask a question. I'll give you 30 seconds. Ask someone around you that preferably someone you don't know this. A simple question. Hi, how are you? What's your name? Where are you from? Go ahead. 30 seconds. That was a bit too successful. But now that I got you all warmed up, to warm up, I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Abudlhadi.
Yes, hi, and welcome to this event. As somebody, we are the Arab and Muslim Ethnicity and Diaspora Studies is the most recent kid on the block in the College of Ethnic Studies. As you all know, we are at the moment of a crisis because of the budget crisis, because of the corporate university, because of all the attacks and the reduction of budget of ethnic studies, and actually the attack on ethnic studies. You know, we know about Arizona, we know about Texas, we know all of, and here at San Francisco State, some of it is not really seen, but some of it is hidden, and we really intend to kind of bring it up. Saying that we are the most recent kid on the block, we find it really important to always acknowledge that we are here in indigenous Estonian Indian lands. And so we are meeting here on the land of indigenous people. For me in particular, as a Palestinian, not only as a scholar and a faculty member, it's very important to acknowledge that and acknowledge that this is a settler colonial state. The United States is a settler colonial state. We talk more about that. I also want to remind us that we are here, we have a college because of the spirit of '68. Because in 1968, students like you rose up and protested and held the longest student strike in the history of this country and demanded that they be taught the topics that reflect their lives and their experiences by faculty that represents and understands who they are, understands the repression as well as the reciprocal engaging. And they succeeded. They wanted a College of Third World Studies. They were given a College of Ethnic Studies for other reasons. We can have discussions about that later if you want. But it's really, really important to remember why we're here, what enables us to become here. The third one I want to mention is that I'm really grateful to my colleagues in Asian American Studies for several reasons. One is that the Association of Asian American Studies was the first association, academic association, in the United States actually to pass a resolution in support of Palestine and for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. It was the first one. Everybody thinks that American Studies Association was the first one, and you want to, why is that the case? Why is it that the American Studies actually gets all the play, but Association of Asian American Studies does not? And there was some history there, so those of you in my class who are going to be doing oral history and archival research, you may want to examine, investigate, learn more. You read articles today about by Diane Fugino and others, Fred Ho, that give you some of the history, and you wrote your memos. So think about that, and through the film and the discussion, you will learn more. But it's really interesting to kind of see where we're at, we were where, and where we're at today. So one of the most important things to think about, not only nostalgia, although we don't want to discount the past and we don't want to forget, because, if we don't know the history, we need to learn the history. So that's really, really important, because many of us do not know the history, so we don't learn, we don't draw lessons from what happened in the history in order for us to inform our actions for today and tomorrow and for a different future, a better word, the word social justice, a better word. Another word is possible. It is possible, but we have to make it so. And we have to make it so collectively, it cannot be each person by themselves and so on. So I'm getting up now from my what you call it, soapbox. And so this is one of the reasons Asian American Studies also has been very supportive of us and AMED here. Also, the Asian American community has historic communities, I should say. I shouldn't say community, so it is multiple diverse community. We have a lot of collaboration. We will talk about that more, but I want to specifically say that the first time I actually saw this film is when we did a collaboration with Pastor Michael Yoshii, who's going to be here. He was here last night on another event talking about Palestinian loss of life and land, a Palestinian village that his group, the Buena Vista United Methodist Church in Alameda County, which was on one of the spots on the Underground Railroad for the No-No boys. The No-No boys were the Japanese young men who were drafted to serve in the US military out of the concentration camps in which they and their families were placed. So they said, no, we are not going to be serving, we're not going to be going to killing other people like us. And so they were sent to prison and so on. Some of them escaped. As you know the Underground Railroad about the African liberation, and you know about the civil rights movement, and you know about people who escaped from slavery here. But this is another story that is not really very well known. So that's the Pastor Michael Yoshii's church. And at the church, we built an event also bringing our Asian American communities and Palestinian communities together. And that's where the film was shown first, actually, a few years ago. And we've been collaborating further and further. Some of you know that we participated in the project called Stories of Palestinian Diasporas, which emerged out of my Pastor Yoshi's church, actually. It did not really emerge with us. It emerged in the community in Alameda in Pastor Michael Yoshi's church, and we proceeded with it. We did a video. We would like to continue with it if we have the resources, and the resources mean material resources, financial, as well as human resources. So those students who are interested in making this happen, we can actually make it happen. In '68, they did not write a grant and get money and clock out at 5, and if something happens at 5:05, nobody is there to watch what's going on. It can happen if people are coming together. So this is one of the, so we have two major people in the community who've been working with us, Pastor Michael Yoshii and Ms. Grace Shimizu. Both are very much involved in the Day of Remembrance, commemorations, and also very much involved in the history of it, as well as making sure it doesn't recur, it doesn't happen again. Learning about that, learning about racism against our community, making sure it doesn't happen again. And Ms. Shimizu is part of Redress movement, which is actually representing the Japanese in Latin America who were kidnapped and brought to this country and actually placed in concentration camp as well. They weren't even US citizens. So we will talk about all of this stuff. So we've been working on this. We came together, and this is part of our collaboration with various departments. In the classroom, we think that this is really important to understand history. So next week, we are going to be having a panel discussion. Actually, the class is going to be on Black liberation, Black power. One of the films we're showing is about Jamal. Students are supposed to be seeing it on their own. And we are going to be having Phil Hutchins, who was the president of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. He's going to be actually with us and speak in the classroom. And there is many more. Please sign the sign-up sheets that are going around if you need to know more, and we can place you on the sign-up list. We'll talk more about that. And then finally, we have a cultural event. We'll talk more about that. That's happening on March 4th. It's an international concert. It was supposed to be a benefit, but we couldn't do it because of university rules and so on. So it's going to be a cultural contest. So we would like for all of you to come. So thank you all for coming.
A few years ago, I filed Freedom of Information Act requests with the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security to get their files on a man named Farouk Abdel-Muhti. I already know what happened. I just want my government to admit it. Instead, it uses words to justify its actions. And what it can't justify, it hides. This is the story of the 2-year fight for Farouk's freedom, and how he inspired me to join this struggle and face its echoes in my family's past. I used to think of history as something written. Now we have other ways to record our own history. We can disprove what our government writes and reveal what it hides. This war was never officially declared, so we don't know when it's going to end. I think it won't be over until we learn when it started.
The Department of Justice is waging a deliberate campaign of arrest and detention to protect American lives. We're removing suspected terrorists who violate the law from our streets to prevent further terrorist attack.
I didn't know why imprisoning 1,200 Muslim immigrants was being called an investigation, since there were no serious terrorism charges against any of them. But in this press conference, the Attorney General gave some historical context to his actions.
On December the 9th, 2 days after Pearl Harbor, Franklin Roosevelt addressed the nation from the Oval Office. Roosevelt put it this way: when we resort to force, as now we must, we are determined that this force shall be directed toward ultimate good, as well as against immediate evil.
The day after 9/11, the New York Times had 25 references to Pearl Harbor and kamikazes. I had a different feeling about that chapter of American history. My mother was born in a barracks in the Utah desert. Along with thousands of other Japanese Americans, they were incarcerated solely based on their nationality. Now my government was locking up Arabs and South Asians on immigration charges and calling them suspected terrorists. The first 9/11 detainees were held at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. The windows of their cells were painted over, shutting out all light from the outside. They'd been essentially disappeared. The government refused to release any information about them except what country they were from, as if their nationality was all that mattered. After what had happened to my family 60 years ago, I couldn't blindly trust my government. Though all I had was a little camera and the help of some filmmaker friends, I started getting my own information.
After Pearl Harbor, the federal government went as far as to Japanese Americans.
Right, and they didn't do that this time, right?
I was pretty intimidated walking into this office with my little camera. Michael Wiles was an immigration attorney and former federal prosecutor who had worked with the government on some high-profile terrorism cases. He also was a city councilman in New Jersey, whose star was rising in the Democratic Party.
There is nothing wrong, in my mind, with profiling the way we are seeing this now. With people who would take planes and smack them into buildings, they are not playing by the rules. The immigration laws are very specific. They allow the Attorney General to take what action he needs to. In fact, they're even more far-reaching than the actions that he's taken on occasion. We don't need to know the substance, so long as the government, the law enforcement community, the intelligence community can root them out.
But what about the argument that when we look back at what happened to Pearl Harbor and the Japanese Americans, everyone agrees that it was wrong.
Who agrees? Who agrees? Right. I think, exigent times call for very strenuous reaction.
I was shocked to hear an immigration attorney defending the internment. But maybe I shouldn't have been. The more I learned, the clearer it became that the internment and the roots of immigration policy were intertwined.
The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Our west coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry. 2/3 of them American citizens, 1/3 aliens. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous. First attention was given to the problems of sabotage and espionage, shipyards, oil wells. Japanese fishermen had every opportunity to watch the movement of our ships.
The history of the United States is a history of racial discrimination, and nowhere is that clearer than in the nation's immigration policies. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882 on the theory that Chinese were undesirable immigrants. As the 20th century dawned, Congress began banning immigration by other Asian groups. Asians remained eternally foreigners, eternal aliens, even if they spent their entire adult lives in the United States.
A date which will live in infamy.
About 1300.
Kind of the title of the event to try and get those kind of ideas going. So it was like Day of Remembrance, which is a time that we remember a certain part of our nation's history, which is one of the worst violations in our country's history around the internment of the Japanese during World War II. But also the idea of criminalizing communities and building solidarity among especially those groups that are kind of being identified as the so-called enemy, whether it's in the past like World War II or today. So maybe if you had any questions of like when, just historical clarification, because a lot of history and all that kind of stuff came out. And then maybe we could take also some questions then about, well, what does it mean when we're criminalizing communities? What does it mean when we're trying to build solidarity? What do we mean by solidarity? So I don't know if that would help focus in.
Just identify yourself, which class you're from, or if you're not from a class, just so we know where you're coming from.
Any historical kind of questions? Like, okay.
I'm going to raise one for you, Rick Grace. Can you draw the analogy between what happened to the people of Japanese descent who were taken from Latin America, brought here, and what we know in the modern war on terrorism, the rendition, in which people have been sent by the U.S. through the CIA to other countries to be interrogated in order to deal with this question? Do you draw an analogy?
Yeah, I guess through the Day of Remembrance, what comes out is really kind of remembering and reflecting on the experience, particularly of the Japanese American community. And I think through the film and then through the work I think that all of us have done is that it just didn't happen to Japanese Americans. It also happened to others during World War II who were identified as the enemy. And they were immigrants from Germany, Italy, Japan. And it's not just that I think that we focus on the Japanese American experience, because that was really, I don't know, unique isn't the right word, but it's like, it was important because it started out as an attack against Japanese immigrants, and because of the racism in this country expanded to the incarceration of U.S. citizens as well. And then what doesn't necessarily get really played out in the history books and our public understanding is there were other folks, other immigrants too, that were identified as the enemy, and also were interned in a whole another set of camps run by the Department of Justice and the Army. And then on top of that is that not only did it affect immigrants inside the United States, but the U.S. government went to Latin America and kidnapped men, women, and children, over 6,000 of them, of German ancestry, Italian ancestry, even some Jewish people that had fled Europe for refuge. They were sent to the United States, along with people of Japanese ancestry, to be interned and used in a hostage exchange for U.S. citizens that were caught in the war zones of Europe and in Asia. And so for us that were like learning more about Japanese American history, more also about our own family stories, then we realized that that part of hidden history is like, if we don't learn that in connection to what we usually learn in classrooms, then it's like a whole set of lessons get lost. A whole set of understanding of what it could mean today gets lost. And that's actually the important thing of Day of Remembrance, is not just to kind of remember, our families that might have been in camp, or kind of recall, bad things that happened to our community in the past history, but also to try and figure out, is there something about that experience that might have commonality with what's happening to other people, not only in the United States, but around the world? Is there some lessons that we can gain so that we don't have to go, other families don't have to go through this, and that our country doesn't have to be built on these kind of experiences? So in that regard, yeah, what happened to the Latin Americans, and that includes my own family, is rendition, where they just kind of kidnap people, bring them to some place, and here it was the United States, and use them for whatever purpose. And like my family was used for hostage exchange. And so then it's like, yeah, that's a rendition. And then at the end of the war, they said, okay, you're illegal aliens. You got to leave the Western Hemisphere because you're an enemy. You were a so-called enemy. And then they just get put on a boat and shoved off. So that's kind of a World War II style rendition.
So for, I think, in a period of World War II, I was
Can
looking
you raise
at,
your voice so I know?
for the World War II period, it felt like for the rest of the Asian American community, it was more, it was one of the more ambiguous moments between other Asians and Japanese when it comes to, how do you say this? The relationships with Japan and China and Korea. I mean, China, Korea, and Philippines hated Japan for lots of things. But they hated Japan for trying to be the Western nations, and they got karma bites of Japanese Americans in the butts. Although, I can't imagine so much pain and suffering the Japanese Americans had experienced, and it's like a lost story that no one wants to talk about. It's hush hush moments within the family, right?
Was there a question?
Yeah.
Well, maybe you can also give a comment.
Did you have a question on that, or sound like you're making a comment? Observation?
It's more like a double comments.
Comment.
Yeah. So sorry.
No problem, no problem. We'll come back, but let's take a few other comments and questions so that we're not giving our speeches.
Leander,
Yeah, my name is Leander.
and you can raise your voice or stand.
I'll stand. I'm Leander. My question is, how, I know you can't speak for the entire Japanese American community, but what do you think, or like, what lessons you were speaking about do you think the Japanese American community may have taken from this experience, and do you think it has changed the way that Japanese Americans view themselves as American citizens, or just as Japanese American citizens, and just how do you think that if there's any conflict or conflict between that identification?
Take a couple more before we respond.
Couple more. People can also comment on the film if you'd like. Yes? Yeah, go ahead.
Has it gotten any better compared to back then? Is it the expansion of the internet, more people learning from social media or from YouTube, or just education?
Yes, Kari.
Okay, I'll introduce myself really quick. I'm Gadi, and I'm in Professor Abudlhadi's class. My question would be, now that we understand the historical connotations of understanding each other's histories as struggling people of color, how can we now, as the newer generation of conscious folk who know about this history, can continue to move forward in building coalitions that are strong and powerful for people of color and understanding our commonalities? So that would be a question.
One more? Yes, Matt.
My name is Matthew. I'm in Professor Abudlhadi's class. Adding on to the question back here, has it gotten any better? I'm wondering if, I think it's self-evident that American respect for civil liberties broadly has gone through a great revolution for the better since 1941. And so in that sense, I'm wondering, and this might just be a thought experiment, if we've gotten to the point where if there had been a Democratic administration with a Democratic leaning judicial and legislative infrastructure, in place during 9/11 under the rightful President Al Gore, would things have been different? Have we gotten to the point where at least we might say that it's an expression of a political divide and not simply a perpetuation of the American paranoia, fear of the other? That's just a question.
We have 4 questions, one about Japanese, American, other Asians, one about lessons, one about if it has gotten any better, and also speculating what would have happened, where do we go from here? So why don't we let each person can take a stab at one of the questions?
We have another question in the back.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Hello. So I just had a question about, like, what do you, all this history and all this context and how, like, the situation has been handled, how do you feel like other countries can learn from that? I mean, our themselves haven't learned from it, but, like, in recent cases with Syrian refugees and allowing them into the country because of, like, their nationality or their religion, like, how do you believe that that should change how the views are still and how racial profiling really affects helping people in need, even from South America, also Salvador and places similar to them?
Just one more question, if I may. Okay. Just to first react to I forgot your name.
Grace.
Yeah, okay. Your point earlier, of course, it wasn't just Japanese Americans. The others were also also suffered the same fate. But I'll just point out that it was Japanese Americans that were singled out for en masse kind of incarceration. The same thing was not done to the Germans or Italians, although individuals were. Okay, so I think that's one. And secondly, a classic colonial and strategy is divide and rule. And I think within a particular area, or different areas, they pit different nationalities under their control against each other. And I think the incarceration of Japanese Americans was a good example of that, because at the time of the war, definitely as the point made earlier, other Asians were, hated the Japanese for the war. And that sort of, the incarceration proved some kind of justification. I mean, it was justified, rather, that those Japanese Americans were incarcerated because this is what they were doing to our country, things like that. And I think that's the classic case where divide and rule was successfully implemented. So there are two just points, not really. How would maybe the question is, how would you deal with that? For instance, in addition to the point earlier of solidarity, I think we need to deal with divide and rule tactics, and how would you deal with that now?
I think I want to jump off that. My name's Berlin. I'm also in Professor Abudlhadi's class. What I want to note is that, yes, we have this information available. It may not be available to everyone, but it's certainly been an increase, and we have an excitement to produce this information. But how is it that we combat this fatalistic idea that we can't do anything, that it renders us unable to act? How is it that we take it upon ourselves and our community to elicit some kind of emotional response, to coordinate, to organize? How is that we enhance these emotions to something other than just speak? I think that's my question.
So let me respond to some of the questions. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Michael Yoshii. I am a United Methodist pastor of the church in Alameda called Buena Vista United Methodist Church. And we serve a historic Japanese population. It was started in 1898 as a fellowship outreach to Japanese immigrants coming into the area. We're now 117 years old. Our congregation members went through the segregation era and also wartime incarceration. So most of the members that were alive at that time would be first and second generation immigrants. Mostly went to Topaz, Utah, the same camp that Conrad's grandparents were at. And they used the church as a hostel after the war when they didn't have places to live, and also used the church as a storage place for their belongings. They could only take a certain amount of things with them as they went. And then just in terms of personal biography, I was born after the war. My grandparents, my grandfather on my father's side lived in Oakland during the time of the evacuation order and had a restaurant that he lost. And so he and my grandmother and my father and brother went to Topaz. They returned to Topaz. My mother's family was from Fresno. They had a farm in Fresno, and her family lost the farm, and they were taken to Jerome, Arkansas for the duration of the war. And Jerome and rural Arkansas were the two camps in Arkansas. One thing I want to note in the film, if you didn't make that connection, that what Conrad was doing with this, and by the way, I had the privilege of meeting Conrad when he was working on the film, when he needed some help to get more funding. And we brought him to our church to do a screening of it, get some review and feedback, and then help him raise some money to go to the next phases of it. So I had a chance to talk quite extensively about it with him too, about how he was approaching making the film. And he didn't intend to intersect his own family story with Farouk's story. Initially, but it's when he began to research and realize that in his own family DNA and historical narrative lie a story that he had not unpacked yet for himself. And as he began to talk to his grandmother and interview her, he started making all these intersections between what he considered to be his family narrative and the larger Japanese American narrative, and then the Palestinian narrative that Farouk was sharing. But to me, the intersections there that are quite interesting is that we're talking about the Japanese American narrative and story, we're talking about the Palestinian narrative, and then we're talking about the post 9/11 situation. So three intersections of three different historical pieces that we're talking about, I think, that are very critical for our understanding today. So to address some of the questions, one was, how do Japanese Americans view the historical experience? What did we learn about it, and how does it change who we are today? Many of you may not know that many of us worked on the redress movement in the 1980s to get apology from the U.S. government for the abridgment of our constitutional rights. That took place in the early 80s. 1981, in fact, were hearings held around the country where Japanese Americans could come forward and tell their stories. A gentleman here said something about, people didn't talk about things. Many of our families didn't talk about it from after the war time. Like when I grew up in my family, they hardly talked about it at all. And we found out later, we could see that a lot of times people were traumatized by the experience and did not want to talk about it, or just did not feel like they could talk about it. In some cases, they didn't want to talk about it because there was just issues that they had about speaking publicly. But in 1981, when the Wartime Commission was established, and this came about through legislation that moved through Congress, it legitimized a place and space for people to come forward and tell their stories. So in San Francisco, there were 2 or 3 days of hearings, and I had a chance to participate myself and testify, and then we did organize in the community to bring out our elders to tell their stories. But it took place in cities where there are major Japanese American populations: Los Angeles, Seattle, New York, Philadelphia, San Francisco. And that became sort of a watershed event for people to tell their stories. And then when Congress deliberated on it, it came 7 years later, 1988, they passed the Civil Liberties Act, apologizing to Japanese Americans and then authorizing redress payments for the losses that people had suffered during the war. That was called the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. So to speak to your point about where the Japanese American community, I think for those, I would say on the progressive end of things, understood that new legislation not only apologized to us, but set a bar and a principle around the protection of civil liberties for other people. And at that time, many of us talked about it. Will this law be something that we will evoke because something's happening to other people down the road? What we didn't imagine to happen was 9/11. When right after 9/11, we started seeing all the deportations, roundups at INS and so forth. The Japanese American communities, Grace among them and other people, were the first to come to the support of Arab, Muslim, South Asian communities. We held rallies in Japantown and different places. At my congregation, the first week after 9/11, I invited a friend who was an imam to come and talk about what's going on with the Muslim community. And I think it's because we had the visceral memory in our bodies about incarceration, about being the face of the enemy, that allowed us to respond immediately while other people were waving the flag and talking about round up these people and let's put them in camps or let's deport them. I think we had that sensibility that, in fact, many of our elders said that too to me on the first Sunday after 9/11. They wondered what was happening with the Arabs and the Muslims because they knew they would be the face of the enemy because they were the face of the enemy after Pearl Harbor. And they had lived through that and still retained that sense of feeling inside themselves. So I say in the best of Japanese American community, people have responded immediately during 9/11 and also have developed a sense of understanding that Japanese Americans didn't get their apology by themselves through Congress. It was on. It was because of what other groups had done, civil rights movement, the 60s movement, that other groups and the consciousness raised of all other ethnic groups and their struggles helped contribute to the awareness that allowed the Civil Liberties Act to be passed. So that many of us in the Japanese American community from that time forward worked very diligently around working in multiracial coalitions. Now, I can't say that's true of all Japanese Americans, because I think there's a Japanese American narrative that says also we did it by ourselves. We pulled ourselves up by the bootstraps. We are good citizens and we deserve what we get. And oftentimes we'll have attitudes that will not accept and embrace the fact that other people helped us get where we are. So I think I just want to share that with you because I think that's a reality. It's a reality because I hear it, I see it. I think the same that all of you in any of your ethnic communities will see that there's a spectrum of where people are coming from in terms of their ideologies. And I would say that what's important about that is that we all develop an ideology around our identity, our consciousness, and what it means to work with other people. So what you value in taking courses like you do with Rabab and with Wesley is sort of understanding how you shape your identity and how you shape a sense of collective self based on the ideologies you develop and formulate over a period of time. And that's a really important thing. And that gets to the question about where are we at today in terms of coalition building. You see, because some people will say we're at a worse point. Okay, what's happened with 9/11 was the beginning of not democratic debate and discussion about what do we do about this, but it was the enter into the, quote, war on terrorism without any debate whether we should go to war. And we've been in that war now in many senses, although, this is ambiguous. Are we really at war now or not? Okay, because I think a lot of this generation has grown up with this understanding that we are at a war with terrorism, but officially there is no war. But unofficially there is a war. And the war has now moved into a place where it's become a security war. And what's happened is that civil liberties have been abridged repeatedly as a result of this expansion of the security war that's going on today. And it now impacts us in immigration issues and the border because of security and because of ideas about who should be in and who should be out. Security issues on the border. It's there manifested in what's happening with Black Lives Matter, in people raising issues about incarceration, militarization of the police. Is because what's been happening is training is going on with police, militarization is going on with police based on a notion that we have to control people. Okay? And then where is all this coming from? Israel. where is the resource going on from all of the militarization at the border and police? It's coming from Israel. Israel is the research and development source of all the resources for police and militarization. And that's something we have to be mindful of, because we talk about the question is, have we gotten better or worse? As far as Palestine goes, we've gotten worse, because the occupation still has gone on, and they've had a license to use Palestinians as the guinea pigs to do research and development on militarization. And they've been able to parlay that economically to come to the U.S., and not just the U.S., but around the world, to be the resources for security tools, to go do trainings, to sell resources for security. Jeff Halper, who was formerly with Israeli, what's the name of the group? Israeli Against Home Demolitions, has written a new book. I think he's in town now, in fact, and he's talked about his research around how the Israeli economy has been, has developed this sense of dependency, but also proliferation of the security industry, and how they have become the point person for security for people around the world. And they don't really care if it's just the U.S., they're doing it for everyone around the world, all countries around the world. So in that regard, there's a lot still to do around the Palestinian issue. And that's why those of us who have made that connection for ourselves in solidarity continue to do that work. And I think there's a lot of other intersections going on with different issues that behoove us to make the connection and locate ourselves in terms of where are we in relationship to the intersectionality of all these issues, and speak our own truth and our own personal narratives as we add to the collective narrative of this to be happening today. I'm going to stop there because I can go on another half an hour.
I'll take it when you're at. Okay, so I would just want, I need to stand up. I can sit down. I just want to add to what Michael has been saying, is that there is also an Israeli group of young people that during the Israeli attack on Gaza, the name of the group is Who Profits. And they did actually research, and they found out that it is in support of what you are saying and Jeff Halper's work, that if Israel actually needs to go into war every 4 or 5 years, because if they don't go into war every 4 or 5 years, they cannot advertise their tanks and bombing planes and so on and say this is tested in battle. So in order for them to be able to sell these weapons, it's pure economics if you want to think about it. Of course, there is militarization and so on. Another thing that maybe some students may know about that is the former police chief of Ferguson, the same county that killed Michael Brown and Hazel, was trained in Israel. So there is a lot of this collaboration going on. So we can talk about that. But I wanted to address, to add some of the questions that Matt asked and I think the person in the back, has it gotten better? Was it? No, somebody else. Okay. So, and you, Matt, raised about the whole question of what had Al Gore been elected. And I don't think so. And I think also Michael has skipped a chapter, which is, you talked only about after 9/11, 2009, but actually my consciousness of the involvement of the Japanese American community in supporting Arabs and Muslims was actually back in the 80s. And in 1986, January 1986, 7 Palestinians and a Kenyan wife of one of them in Los Angeles were arrested. They were handcuffed, they were shackled, they were arrested by over 200 agents from the FBI, the INS at the time, the Immigration Naturalization Service, Farouk was talking about, and the Secret Service, and they were taken to prisons in LA, and it said war on terrorism hits LA. Okay, and then I need to finish on that because I'm speaking. Sorry. Somebody raised their hand.
Oh.
I missed a part of what you were saying.
Oh, yeah. I was saying that there were over 200 agents that went and arrested 7 Palestinians and a Kenyan wife of one of them in Los Angeles. They became to be known the LA8, and actually that's when the Japanese American community was one of the first communities to go there. And why did this happen? Just to connect it with the whole question of quote-unquote foreign policy as opposed to domestic policy. I put them in parentheses because I think it's very problematic to separate the two. Because the way it gets separated is in order for people not to think about certain issues and think about them outside of the borders of the United States. Therefore, they don't concern us. So when you say foreign, then foreign, alien, and things like that. So what happened, the reason that this all happened is that in the early 80s, Ronald Reagan comes to power. He becomes the president in 1980. And of course, if people remember, the first act he does is to crush the air controller, the
air traffic
controllers. That was the first action. Then he goes after the women's movement, after all movements, and everybody's not saying it's not about me. It's the same thing that happened in the Second World War, when there is the German priest who says that the first they came after the Jews, I didn't do anything because I wasn't Jewish. They came after the Romanos, the gypsies, they called at the time, where I didn't do anything. They came after the homosexuals, I didn't do anything. And then they have 3 dots because they came and then there is nobody left to actually build coalition to support anybody, which reinforces what Michael is saying. And so Reagan was trying to crush, there was a very rising movement specifically against US intervention in Central America. Because the movements in Central America, in Nicaragua, the Sandinistas, the FDR, FMLN, and El Salvador, were actually really rising. So they wanted to crush it. They couldn't do that. They tried to have congressional hearings. They brought CSPES, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, and so on. It didn't work. They were trying, if people remember or read about the Iran-Contra affair at the time, that's for another class. But I hear international relations not allowing people to discuss Iran or Palestine or Israel or so on. So maybe you learn about it in our classes. You come to our class. But anyway, so they tried to crush it. So what they did, and I mean this is really a policy that we have just heard about, which is very unfortunate. But what they did is they thought that we will go after the weakest link. What's the weakest link in the peace and justice movement? The Palestinians. Yeah. At that time, the U.S. peace movement was basically completely invisibilizing the question of Palestine. They did not want to deal with it. They thought it was invisible and so on. So they went and targeted these people in L.A. under a very old relic of McCarthyism in the 50s called the McCarran-Walter Act, under the name of the 2 Congress people who passed it. And the McCarran-Walter Act says that people can be excluded and not allowed to have citizenship and to stay in the United States, have residence, if they were prostitutes, if they were communists, right? This is something like that, right? So then they said, so how are they going to attack the Palestinians? They said they were part of a leftist organization that was communist. Then, so what happened is that the Japanese American community supported the civil liberties movement. It was actually counterproductive because the Palestinian community and the Arab community and the Muslim community and other communities said, we're not going to have the fear instilled in our hearts. They packed 3 buses and they went into the prison where these people were imprisoned. There was a huge movement that was built, and I was involved in that movement, so I can share with people a lot of stuff on it, but we also have a whole bunch of articles on that. And even the American Civil Liberties Union, the American Jewish Congress, the American Jewish Committee, a lot of people said, we're not going to let this happen. But the first community actually was the Japanese American community. I remember Leonard Weinglass, who was a very well-known lawyer with the American Civil Liberties Union. He was defending Puerto Ricans in Hartford, Connecticut, the Puerto Rican 15 in Hartford, Connecticut. And the Puerto Ricans said to him, you know what, we don't need you that much, go defend the Palestinians, they need you more. This is the kind of solidarity that was happening that's actually not even written. So the short story is that they ended up spending this LAA 20 years fighting for this. Only in 2007, the case was settled, 2 people were allowed citizenship, some of them were deported already. But what's really, really important is McCarran-Walter Act was repealed under the initiative of Barney Frank, a Democratic congressman from Massachusetts, except they removed everything and they put exclusion on the basis of PLO. So these people could still get deported. The Supreme Court, there was a case that was posed for the Supreme Court on behalf of the Palestinians, and we lost the case because the Supreme Court came back and said, residents, people who have green card do not have the same rights as citizens. So that was also basis of the exclusion. Enemy aliens, we discovered in 1980s that there was something called the Vice President Task Force on Alien Terrorists and Undesirables. The Vice President was none other than George Herbert Bush, the senior, the guy he was, before the head of the CIA and so on. And they wanted to set up concentration camps for citizens of 7 Arab countries and Iran in Ogden, Louisiana, because quote unquote it has desert conditions that will work for the Arabs or Muslims, because we all come from the desert. Nobody has mountains or coasts or not that there's anything wrong with the desert. And they said that the reason they wanted to murder them, they were after what happened to the Japanese in the Second World War. I mean, there is all this history. So the McCarran-Walter Act was repealed, but the problem is that After 9/11/2001, the Patriot Act, a lot of the provisions were taken specifically from what happened with the LA8 case. And what happened in 1997, let me see what it was. In 1997, they passed all these anti-terrorism laws, and actually the Clinton administration reinforced them. So I don't think if Al Gore had been in power, because whereas in other cases there is a difference between the Democrats and the Republicans on at least quote-unquote foreign policy on Vietnam and so on, they were divided. That was, it was actually possible to kind of like end the war at one point, not to mention the heroic resistance by the Vietnamese people. But when it comes to Palestine, there is the two parties, the two main parties are always competing. Who is more pro-Israel and anti-Palestinian country? And if you watch the legislation, this is where it comes on. This continues until today. I don't want to take more time. I will mention the case of Rasmiya Aouda, the Palestinian woman who was denied citizenship, and now they want to deport her. And they want to deport her because they said she lied on her application for citizenship because she said she has never been arrested. She actually spent 10 years in Israeli prison after sexual torture. I mean, she was sexually tortured and other torture in the prison, and then she finally signed a confession in Hebrew. The interesting thing is that there is another woman, her name is Ayan Hirzi Ali. She's a Somali former member of the Dutch parliament, who the Dutch parliament discovered that she lied on her application for asylum. She said that she was subject of female genital cutting and so on. It turns out that all of it is a lie. All of the stuff is a lie. So they took away her citizenship. That she's in the United States gives her rewards her, gives her citizenship and a very cushy job in Washington. So it wasn't really about whether you lie on your citizenship application or not. And then we know the most recent chapter is what's going on, the repression, including on campuses. And if any of you is interested to know, I can give you a lot of information. The General Union of Palestinian Students who are here, some of them are in the room. We can share lots of information about this very insidious network of very zealous pro-Israeli groups that seem to be grassroots little groups, but they're actually part of a very well-financed network that is funded by the likes of Adelson, the Koch brothers. Multi-billion dollars of funding is going on in order to attack and target any faculty member, any student group, Students for Justice in Palestine, anybody, not who is just critical of Israel, anybody who even wants to talk about the issue. You're not even allowed to talk about the issue. When you talk about the issue, the truth comes out. So that's not even allowed. So this is, but I don't think it is worse. I think the occupation is worse, but I think the movement is actually, we are at a very good place because people are building coalitions, they are coming together. We are coming together today. So I am actually hopeful. Yes, oh maybe that's why, yes.
So I'll respond within it being our favorite. Can someone, I ordered sandwiches from the Vietnamese place.
Yeah.
Can someone pick it up? Just ask, it's under my name, Wesley. Thanks. You're my class, so I'll on the same thing. So I'll keep mine really brief, but I guess a lot of questions came up, and then actually Lawrence's comment. So I kind of want to tie them all together. So I think the last question was that jumped off from divide and conquer and what can we do? It's my alarm for the sandwich. And I kind of want to get really basic here, but I think it's when Lawrence is my student. I'm really proud of, he said you feel the pain of the people, who were, we're really feeling pain during World War II. And I think that's where we start in coalition building. That's where we cut through this crap of divide and conquer. And I speak out of experience because I'm a third generation Okinawan. So my class know what Okinawan is and what Okinawans are. I talk about it all the time. There was a time as a third generation Okinawan grown in Hawaii, I didn't know who I was, so I started from the question. So again, I say generate questions. Who am I? And that question always came up. my name is different from other Japanese. My grandmother had tattoos on her hands. My mom would act a certain way among the Japanese. She would be subservient. So I was wondering what's the background of that? So as part of my root search, I gravitated to ethnic studies at the University of Hawaii. And then I wanted to learn Okinawan music and dance. And the first teacher I had was this Mr. Yamasato on the island of Kauai where I grew up. And I didn't understand in Japanese, but he told me he had come from Peru. And I go, what? Peru? I thought you were from Okinawa. So you went from Okinawa to Peru. But that's how I met Grace. I always had this question, why is Mr. Yamasato from Peru? Then when I moved to the Bay Area, I met Grace, and we talked about it. And I found out that there were about 2,264 Latin Americans forcibly brought to the U.S. and put into internment camps here. So that started me thinking about the broader context of my identity. And it led me to the basic stuff of imperialism, militarism, colonization. And that's where my point of inquiry began. And so I give you one story. Working with Grace on the Japanese-Peruvian Oral History Project, I was able to go to Peru where I met Nisei, a woman who was her parents were from Okinawa, but she had been born in Peru. But her family was taken to Crystal City, Texas in a Department of Justice camp. Then after the war was over, the US government said, you're illegal aliens, you must leave this country. So they couldn't go back to Peru, and they decided to go back to Okinawa. And Okinawa had been devastated in this battle between the US and Japanese forces. To protect the rest of Japan, the Japanese military used Okinawa as cannon fodder. She went back to Okinawa after that, and then she said they went back to US-occupied Okinawa. After the Battle of Okinawa, the US occupied Okinawa. So Okinawa is occupied territory, much like Palestine is occupied territory. So she told me at night, when their family went back to Okinawa, they had to close all their doors. And I said, why do you have to do that? Because at night, the American soldiers would come out looking for women to rape. So that blew my mind. I'm in Peru talking to a woman whose parents were from Okinawa. She grew up in Peru, was sent to the U.S., sent to U.S.-occupied Okinawa. And I said, what's that like? She says, yeah, she talked about being under the U.S. shadow the whole time, because South America was pretty much our backyard. And that was the reason why the U.S. could go in and take people from Latin America. But it's the question of imperialism. It covers, or it embraces us all. And that's the point I want to make. And then we feel it. I think we all feel it. And so that's why, like when Lawrence talks about feeling the pain, I think that maybe that's the start where we can start, because I think we all feel the pain of being under imperialism, under militarization, colonialism. So that's so. When the sandwiches come, we can all eat together. Only got 10.
Don't worry. We have evaluation forms. Can you please just fill out the evaluation forms? They look like this. You all have them. If you don't have them, come by and pick them up. All right, just do them before you leave. Yeah, I know.
Sorry, you guys. We got 10 more minutes.
Okay.
Okay, so those were really good questions.
Can we have peace, please? Silence.
Yeah, I really appreciate the questions that folks had, because really those are questions that there's no easy answers for, and that I think we have to all work together to figure out where to go forward. How do you use our understanding of history and to make this whole world a better place? So then I was looking on the stuff on maybe some question that hadn't been addressed yet, and that was around the lessons from the World War II internment. And I jotted some down. There's lots more, and that's actually work that still needs to be done, is to figure out what those lessons are. Because the thing is that the way we learn our history is that it's not a complete history. A lot of folks say, hey, I already know JA history. I already know what happened to the war. Let's move on. You know, and that actually, before 9/11 happened, that was a dominant thought, especially among younger folks in our community. And then when 9/11 happened, it's like, what are we going to do? You know? And what happened with 9/11 was, I'm really proud to say the JA community stepped up. It's not everybody in the community, but we were among the first, if not the first, to do so. But the call that went out was, we don't want what happened to Japanese Americans to happen to Arab Americans or Muslim Americans. And we didn't have, as Japanese Americans, a strong enough understanding of our own history that we could say, what's happening to the Arabs, the Muslims, the South Asians with the special registration on all, that happened to our Issei. We just framed it in terms of, we don't want mass incarceration of US citizens again. You know, and that just missed the boat. But it was important to get out there. It's just to say, we have a lot of work to still do to understand our history and uncover the stuff so that we can be able to draw out the lessons. And the thing is that in our community, the people that live through it, they're dying. They're almost going to be dead in several years. Okay? So then the point is who's going to document, who's going to preserve, who's going to interpret our history? You're going to leave it to the JAs to do it? I hope not. This has to be, this part of history has to be embraced by all of us as part of US history, as part of world history. We got to figure it out together. You can't just rely on one group to try and get their act together and come up with something. So in that, some of the lessons that, that I was thinking might be good to share here is the government lies. You know, surprise. But you'd be surprised. Coming into school, a lot of people are shocked. You know, they think, how can our government lie to us? It's, for some people, it's a big hurdle. And they aren't just, you know, from high school coming into college. We're talking about a lot of different ages. And the government consciously perpetrates violations against people, including its own citizens. And we have a whole history of it, and some of our history books document it. So then, and that the government lies and violations, they're stopped by people. It's not like all of a sudden it just stops. It's people organizing together that stops these lies and violations. But the government has an interest to keep people from knowing about this stuff. So the reason you don't know about it in school, the reason we had to even form ethnic studies, and it was a fight to do so, was because we had to demand to know our history. We had to fight the interests out there of governments, of corporations, of different political entities like that, of wanting to keep that knowledge from us. And so we know that information is a very powerful tool. So then, and that it's important that all of us take up the responsibility to document, preserve, and interpret our own histories. And that we don't have to just silo ourselves within our own ethnic group. We can embrace people's history and relate to it as part of our own understanding of the world. And that therefore it's like important to have witnesses. And right now, we are all witnesses to history unfolding. History being transmitted, history being interpreted, and history in the making. So the question is, are you going to actively take up that role of being a witness and participating in whatever change can happen? And then it's like, I just wanted to say around the redress stuff. for Japanese Americans, that passage of that legislation, Civil Liberties Act, was a big deal. When the idea of redress first came up, people didn't want to do it because they said, oh, it's going to open up wounds, or oh, it's shameful. We don't want our neighbors to know what happened. They're going to start treating us different. Or I'm afraid that if this becomes public, they're going to do it to us again. You know, all these kind of reasons of why it was too painful. And then let's face it, some of our folks, it was so traumatic that they don't even remember it happened. You know, it's like that's a memory hole for them. And for us to even ask people to please, will you give us an oral history? Can you tell us, Grandma, what happened? It's like reliving the trauma. You know, so then here it's like the lesson we learned was redress, struggling for truth, struggling for justice was healing for our community. It began to be okay to talk about these things that were deemed by somebody to be taboo, shameful, scary, whatever. And that not only was it a healing experience, but it's also an empowering experience. Because here we were carted off to concentration camps, and then suddenly we can take our history into our own hands and articulate what happened and demand that the strongest government in the world make an apology and do something about it. So, but then I think what happens is, if you look at the literature that's being taught in Japanese American history, and you go to the bookstores and stuff, when you look at redress, if you wanted to learn more about it, you'll know a lot of things about redress, but it's up to the date that that legislation was passed. You know, so, okay, that's a lesson. Having legislation passed seems to be real important, but that wasn't the only thing that was happening. And then, so why is it that we don't have more research on, well, how was it implemented? Who was excluded and didn't get redress, like the Japanese Latin Americans? Why is it that the narrative isn't being more have critical thinking to it? Because sometimes people think that, oh, now the United States government has realized that it has made a mistake, they apologize. Oh, what a vindication for democratic institutions. What a vindication for Japanese Americans. They're loyal, you know? But then it's like, we have to be careful, because that kind of a narrative, if you don't have critical thinking, can also be flipped and said, there's the minority. If this ever happens to anyone else, we'll give them, what, 20 grand? And that's the cost of doing business. But we know that if you're loyal, you'll go to internment camps. If you're loyal, you'll fight in the army. If you're loyal, you'll do this and that. So we don't want the experience, the trauma, the conflicts within our own communities to be used in that way, so to the detriment not only of the people that are affected, but really our future generations. Because right now, everything that happened to the Japanese Americans through the National Defense Authorization Act, Patriot Act, all these laws that have passed, everything that happened to Japanese Americans can happen now to anybody in this room, and it's legal. You can just disappear and be held in detention indefinitely without charge, without trial, without legal counsel, and you're gone. You know, so then the thing is that then it's just to underscore the need for solidarity, because there's not one individual, one group, one organization, one community that is going to be able to do what is necessary in terms of education and organizing to be able to, for us to reclaim our Constitution and defend our democracy. So.
I'd like to close our event tonight. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Rabab, for organizing this. Thank you, Dan, for filming this. And our
Chris,
guests.
can I just make an announcement? I want to make an announcement. My father, who is 94, was interviewed recently by Al Jazeera about this story, leaving Oakland and going to Topaz, and it's supposed to air tomorrow. So if you follow Al Jazeera social media news, it's going to be on that. I think like a 4-minute video.
And for students in my class, be sure to watch it because it will be on assignment.
Okay, thank you, Reverend Yoshii and Shimizu.
All right, there is more food. Where is the rest of the food? We have Palestinian food back. Why don't we put all the food in the same place?
All the food is in the back.
My students